Okay, let's see. Wait, can people see me on the original stream? Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, Dub just linked to that. Let me edit the description. Okay. Sorry about this, guys. I try to be very respectful of other people's time, which means spending a lot of time last night I thought figuring all of this out. But let me @channel everyone. Hey, Gilly. Okay. And boom. Okay. So I'm going to @channel people. I'm going to give it a minute. Sorry, I guess that probably means we'll start about 15 minutes late. I very much did not want to do that, but my bad. I'll go back later and figure out what I did wrong. It looks like for anyone that cares about streaming details, and you know who doesn't. I think the difference is this is my first time doing it on YouTube. The last time I did it on Twitch, and Twitch you just kind of configure and upload a single streaming key, and it looks like the way that YouTube works, you generate a new ingestion key for each event. But it looks like I lost and couldn't figure out how to get back the ingestion key for the original event that I made. Actually, you know what I should do is I should go in and delete that other stream page, just so that if people go there, they don't think that they should just be waiting around there for the stream to start. We can begin now-ish then. Let me, sorry about that, you guys. Let me, all right. Okay, so just assuming that everyone can hear me, I guess you guys probably can. I see some thumbs up. Actually, I see people saying that they see me. Can someone post in Fireside Chat if they can also hear me and if my volume is okay? I just want to make sure of that before I go too much further. Okay. All right, excellent. Whew, okay, well, let's get started then. So this meeting is the second Board of Directors Fireside Chat that we've given to kind of supplement the Fireside Chats that the Executive Director already gives. This one is going to be primarily a status update about the HR process that we discussed on the March 23rd volunteer meeting, as well as the April 11th previous Board of Directors Fireside Chat. And for those of you who are not super familiar with the Fireside Chat format, then it's going to be mostly a presentation given by me, but I'm going to pause periodically at a couple of predefined points during the presentation to kind of answer questions. And so you can go to that tinyurl.com/fireside chat questions to kind of just, and you don't have to wait until that pause for questions period. You can just submit stuff there, and then periodically I'll go through and just kind of answer questions in the order in which they were submitted. And then at the very end, we'll kind of all jump into a shared Google Meet to have more of a back and forth conversation as opposed to like a presentation with occasional Q&A breaks. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start by giving a bit of background on just like what this meeting is all about and what kinds of stuff I'm going to go over. Like I said, this is primarily an HR process status update, so I'll kind of go over at a high level what that means, and then I'll go into kind of a review of like what the HR process was, and then at that point I'm actually going to pause for questions before we even start talking about the actual conclusions and recommendations that came out of the HR process, because I think particularly in a situation like this where we often can't go into a lot of specific details about like what's in people's HR files or about things, that it's like really especially important for people to understand what the process was by which the decisions were made, like especially because they don't we can't share like all of that underlying information. Then I'll kind of review at a high level what the kind of recommendations and conclusions were, and then I'll go into some updates on some of the office restructuring that is an ongoing thing that is very much kind of a part of a lot of this, and some of that was talked about at our previous BOD Fireside chat and as well as at Spring MagCon. And then I'll pause for questions again, and I think that's where probably the bulk of the questions will be, since it's about the actual conclusions and recommendations. And then, like I said, we'll retire into a Google Meet. So for those of you who haven't seen the previous Fireside Chat, I highly recommend you check it out, even if you're listening to this one. I'm going to cover a lot of, kind of different topics in this one than I covered in the last one. I'm actually trying very hard to not rehash like a lot of the same points that I went over in that last one. So if you haven't seen that, it will still be helpful, I think, for you guys to go check that one out. There's only a couple of things that at a high level I'm going to go over that were here. And because this Fireside Chat, this BOD Fireside Chat, is specifically about being a status update on the HR process, that means that it's kind of separate from our next regularly scheduled quarterly Fireside Chat, which is going to be on Thursday, July 11th. And that's going to be kind of a more regular, normal one, where we're going to talk about like status updates on the like upcoming BOD election, what kinds of things have been on the board of directors agenda, like what have we been working on over the past few months other than this. What has the advisory task force been doing, and the finance task force, and the futures task force, and what have you. So that's the kind of thing that we would that we'll normally be going over in these kinds of quarterly things. And so you should definitely if you care about this kind of level of thing that we tend to go into, then definitely check that next one out. But this one is going to be mostly about, and I'll go over this just at a high level without trying very hard to not just kind of repeat things from the last status update. But as many of you know, on March 19th of this year, of 2019, then there were a number of emails that were sent out to pretty much all of the the volunteer mailing lists. So they pretty much went out to our entire volunteer force. And those emails contained a number of letters, including from several former employees of MAGFest Incorporated, that expressed some really serious concerns about the MAGFest leadership, the MAGFest office, how things were being run, and in particular the kind of behavior and conduct of the MAGFest executive director, Nick Marinelli. And so this triggered quite a lot of discussion on Slack, much of it occurring on Slack and elsewhere that week. And then there was also a March 23rd meeting that was organized by Josiah, our volunteer head of the Staff Services Division for Super MAGFest. And we engaged very much in that conversation. And one thing that I will repeat that we did cover in the last meeting, but I am going to repeat it here because I think it's very important, is that we made a very deliberate decision that we, in the board of directors and in leadership, we were going to engage with those conversations on Slack, in spite of the fact that that's very much kind of against our normal stated policies in other circumstances. As a general rule, if you have complaints or concerns about like individual specific people at any level of the organization, whether we're talking about, a member of the board of directors all the way down to like a random department head or manager or volunteer, then those are things that are not appropriate generally to talk about in public Slack channels. And the general rule of thumb is that when you're offering feedback on someone, then you should only discuss it in a public Slack channel if it's a discussion that you believe that the person you're talking about would be comfortable being discussed in public. Otherwise, you should be discussing it either with them or with their superior on the org chart. But we decided to make an exception to that kind of normal policy because like the nature of a lot of the complaints and concerns that were being expressed in these letters was basically that like proper channels were either ineffective or they didn't exist or they weren't being followed. And again, if you want to sort of see our overall response to that topic, you should definitely look at the like April 11th Fireside chat that's linked here above. But we did engage with that on Slack that week, and with the volunteers in the March 23rd meeting. And it just so happens that the previous week, before all of that happened, we had just hired a new third-party HR specialist named Tracy. And Tracy's first week was literally the week. I think she started the day before those letters dropped, and it's a heck of a first week. And so we immediately began consulting with her on what our response should be, how we should manage this sort of thing, and and what the process should be going forward. And we immediately started implementing like some of the suggestions that she had for us at that time. One of which was to start doing these like status update fireside chats, as well as like quarterly board of directors fireside chats, like the one that we're so basically what we're doing right now. And the other was to create a couple of forums that didn't already exist. So like we already have BOD at magfest.org and also BOD advisor at magfest.org if you want to get in touch with the advisory task force that tends to handle volunteer matters. There's the board of directors channel in Slack and the advisory channel in Slack, but Tracy recommended that we create another couple of channels that people could use if they have concerns particularly about the MAGFest office that they want to share with the members of the board of directors who are not themselves MAGFest employees. And so we have this new BOD volunteers at magfest.org mailing list that contains all of the non-employee members of the MAGFest board of directors, as well as our general counsel and HR specialist, Tracy. And then we also have this like anonymous feedback form that like if for whatever reason you would prefer to like not send us an email, then and maybe even don't want to have your name attached, you can attach it or not, but then we have this like mechanism by which you can fill out an anonymous form to kind of submit concerns. And so that that's all something that we started just the week that those letters dropped, and and have kind of been giving status updates on, and that's what this meeting is basically about. Whoops, pardon me. So like at that time, we also began to talk to Tracy about, hey, there's a lot of very unsettling things, kind of being brought up, or there are a lot of things that are in the content of these letters that we would really like a professional assessment on. Like so we started talking to Tracy during that week about what that would actually look at, and then we, the board of directors, decided to ask her to, just kind of run through an HR process and conduct a thorough review, and so like I wasn't. That was still in process at our last Fireside Chat status update, but I want to give a bit more information about what that actually consisted of, because what ended up happening was that over the next couple of months, Tracy ended up spending dozens of hours going over quite a lot of different sources of information in order to conduct a thorough review and give like a thorough assessment of what happened. So this started with her, of course, like reading the actual letters themselves, and as well as just reading through just all the conversation that happened that week on Slack. She also reviewed everything that was submitted through the new anonymous feedback form, as well as email submissions through the BOD volunteers list that we created at her urging, and then she also encouraged us on the board of directors to reach out to people who had submitted letters and then like avail themselves of of those new things to basically sort of like submit feedback in a bit more detail than maybe what they felt like they were comfortable going into in the letters that they wrote that they intended for kind of more public consumption. And then beyond that, Tracy then reached out to to both current employees as well as past employees, including ones who had kind of written letters but had not availed themselves of those contact methods. She also spoke to contractors and then current and former volunteers to basically just get a thorough sense of like, hey, what is your take on all of this? And this was not limited to the substance of, kind of particular complaints that were in the letters. Really what we wanted her to do was to ask like, hey, what concerns do you have? What things do you think I should be aware of? What things do you think the board of directors needs to be aware of and needs to be acting on? Whether it's things that you feel they already are acting on, or particularly things that you think that they're not. And so then as part of that, she reviewed, kind of other supporting documents that would include anything that was like submitted in these ways, or just things that that people said during this process. Hey, here's something you can look at. Here's like an email I think you should read that, kind of gets at the heart of what I'm talking about, or like here's a document from my time at MAGFest that I think really kind of goes into some of these details. And so all told, those were the sorts of things that she looked at and spent time reviewing over the course of a couple of months, spending like, several dozen hours on this. And then when all of that was done, she wrote up a report, and then she presented it to the MAGFest Board of Directors, containing a number of conclusions and recommendations. So we took that, we discussed it amongst ourselves, decided to go forward with her recommendations, and then at that point we decided that, hey, let's loop in the MAGFest Advisory Task Force on that, because that is a group that, I think this is a situation where it's useful to have just like another take on this, and and to have like another point of view, and to have like kind of as many people as we can reasonably manage kind of get looped in. So based on the sort of recommendations from Tracy, our HR specialist, as well as Bunny, our general counsel, we did not share the kind of underlying documents and documentation with them, but we did broadly review the substance of what was submitted to us, what we went over, as well as like the content of what was reviewed and the content of Tracy's report to us, and gave them the kind of opportunity to like ask questions both to her and to the board of directors itself. And and so I just want to say that in general, this is a process that we feel very good about. This is something that we feel very satisfied with the scope of, and I personally am a big believer that when something like this happens, it's really important to not just ask yourself, what are we going to do about this, but to really say, okay, what is a good process for figuring out what we are going to do about this? Like, not just like what decision do we think we're going to make, but how do we think we are going to make the decision? And I think this is a process that I personally very much stand behind, and it's something that the entire board of directors is unanimous in in standing behind as well. And I should say that like obviously we're going to get to the questions, to get to the conclusions and recommendations that came out of this. But before I go forward on that, I do want to pause for questions here to see if anyone has anything. Okay, yeah, so one person actually asked like a very good question. When Tracy gave her initial recommendations or review to the board, was Nick in the room? And the answer, okay, that's a great question. It should have occurred to me to say this, because obviously if you're talking to someone about if you're talking to the board about a particular person, having them in the room would obviously color the way that happens. And the answer is no. So the specific timeline of what happened there is that Tracy submitted her report to the board of directors, and then we had a discussion with her over email about that, and in which the board of directors reviewed, kind of her findings, had the opportunity to like ask her questions, and then arranged to have a meeting with her in person. But for that initial thing, Nick was not in the room, and that was an email conversation that like Nick was not a part of. Okay, cool. I'll pause a moment to see if anyone has any other questions, and then I'll go ahead and move on. I don't know how quickly this Google spreadsheet updates, so all right, cool. So one of the things that I said at our previous meeting is that in general the board of directors gives very broad deference, and like it just is extremely deferential, and tends to really just go along with any legal advice that we receive and any HR advice that we receive. We feel like over the years MAGFest as an organization has gotten pretty good at running awesome events, but that is different than being like specialists and having particular domain knowledge in how to properly run and administer a corporation, how to comply with requirements, how to follow best practices and standard procedures. directors. And so if an HR specialist tells us, hey, this is a thing that you should be doing, then like we tend to listen, and we tend to like go along with that, even if it's something that we would not ordinarily be inclined to do. And similarly, along those lines, I should say, at our previous meeting, we expressed that, hey, up until this point, we have followed all of the recommendations that our HR specialist has provided, and we intend to continue doing that in the future. And in fact, we have. All of the recommendations that Tracy made as part of her report have either already been implemented or in the process of being implemented. And so, and really, like I said, what ultimately happened, what we kind of asked Tracy to do was to evaluate the current state of the MAGFest office, as well as reviewing an oral history of just the past MAGFest office based on accounts of current and former employees, contractors, and volunteers, based on accounts and events of things that they considered important or significant. And then, Tracy made a number of recommendations, but her central conclusion to us was that swapping out the executive director of MAGFest is not only uncalled for by these circumstances, but would in fact be actively harmful to MAGFest Incorporated as an organization. And so as a result of this, like after reviewing Tracy's recommendations and asking her extensive follow-up questions about, kind of the beat-by-beat, blow-by-blow of everything, then, we on the board of directors continue to be comfortable with the decisions we've made, and we continue to fully support Nicholas Marinelli as the executive director of MAGFest at this time. And, look, obviously we're going to be continuing our ongoing efforts to sort of like reshape the leadership of MAGFest and mess around with like what the job responsibilities are and who's doing what, and I'm going to talk about that, in the next slide. That's something that we've been talking about for months, and it's something that we have been talking about since before this process began. But I do want to make it clear that, those changes were, although they were informed by the kinds of legal and HR advice that we've gotten, these are changes that are not happening as a result of this HR process. No changes to anyone's position are happening as a result of this review or of any recommendations that were made. And so I'm going to go over, kind of the categories of what her recommendations are. Again, it's not that we're not changing anything. There were, kind of particular actionable things that came out of this process, and I'm going to talk about like what some of those are. I'll go into a little bit more detail, about them and particularly the restructuring, and then I'll kind of do more Q&A. So the three main categories of things that Tracy came up with were, the first is volunteer communication. I already talked about some of this, but like the fact that we're doing these fireside chats, the fact that like this is the mechanism by which we are like communicating to you, was something that came as a direct result of Tracy's like recommendations to us. The fact that we're doing quarterly BOD fireside chats similarly, and she's also had a lot of good things to say about like how we should be communicating on Slack, what things it is appropriate and not appropriate to communicate on Slack, how we should direct people, and also how we should make sure that like when Slack is not an appropriate place to talk about something, making sure that like what spaces do we create for people to like raise those concerns to us so that we are still talking about them, just like in a useful and productive way. So that's the volunteer side of thing, but then on the office side, she also had a number of recommendations that were around resources for the office. So this ranges from what trainings it would be useful for MAGFest employees to go through, as well as like one thing that is, a significant change that's going to be coming is, in addition to having an external HR specialist, Tracy specifically recommends having a semi-weekly part-time in-office MAGFest contractor to serve as, HR contractor. This would be someone other than Tracy herself, but basically like, an actual HR person to be in the MAGFest office periodically to be a resource for the employees so that, concerns can be raised up and things can be discussed, like, a lot, as they come up and as they happen rather than, significantly later. That's something that, we didn't previously have budgeted, and so we're going to be working with the finance task force to figure out how that fits into our plan for 2019 and 2020, and where that money comes from in the budget. But as I said, hey, that's not something we were previously planning on doing, and it's something that is potentially kind of expensive, but when it comes to these kinds of issues, be they legal issues or HR issues or tax issues or finance issues, when it comes to how to run a company, this is something where we tend to follow these sorts of recommendations, whether it's easy or not. And then the last thing is that the sorts of like role restructuring that we've already talked about at our previous meeting and a little bit more at Spring MagCon, there was some good feedback on there, which I'll go into now, and then I'll kind of open it back up to Q&A, since I imagine this is the section where people are going to have the most questions. So when it comes to these like changing of roles and like reshaping the MAGFest leadership, we really went back and forth on the board of directors and with the advisory task force, and in our conversations with Tracy about whether this was something we even wanted to talk about in this meeting, like right now. And the concern that we had was that when we're talking about an HR review that was generated because of complaints that people had about the MAGFest office and particularly the MAGFest executive director, then giving a presentation in which we talk about like a restructuring of the office or like responsibilities being handed off to other people, that could erroneously come across as punitive in some way, that we could mistakenly give the impression to people that because of this HR process that we are making these changes in the office that we would not have otherwise made, and that responsibilities are being taken away from someone and given to something else. That is not the case, and like I said, we almost didn't even talk about this in this presentation for fear of giving that impression. But the problem is that we felt like but we felt like we did really need to talk about this, and kind of accept that risk of miscommunication, because before this process began, and especially after it, we've talked to a lot of volunteers about concerns that they have about Super MAGFest the event, or MAGFest Incorporated as an organization, or just like what it's like to be a volunteer, or like how is the office responding to volunteer needs and things like that, and and this is what we're doing. This office restructuring is what we are doing in order to address those things. And so we ultimately decided that we could not be talking about like how we are handling, just in general, like letters aside, like complaints that people have or concerns that they've raised up to us. Like we can't talk about these things without talking about this office restructuring. And so as we said at our last meeting, like one thing that is already like certainly happening is that the executive director role is already being split up. In 2018, the executive director had more than 20 people directly reporting to them. That is much too many. And so we are ultimately splitting off a chunk of those responsibilities into an events director role, and some of this has already happened. Those of you who are at Spring MagCon will know that Deborah Lennox has already been promoted to the role of events director. And then we are also planning in the long run to create a managing director role. So we'll have an events director that is volunteer facing, and a managing director that kind of keeps the lights on and makes sure that our finances and taxes are being handled and make sure that the MAGFest office is running. And so I want to talk a little bit about like what that review process has looked like, because we've already told you that we are doing this, but we haven't really gone into a lot of details about like how are we making those decisions and how are we deciding what to do. And so back in January, we started talking about this in earnest, the board of directors with the MAGFest office. And as a starting place, we took the job that the executive director is currently doing and then kind of just broke it down into a list of, it was somewhere between 80 and 90 different things. And then for each of those things, we did what's called a RACI evaluation. So what that means is for each like item on that list, we asked ourselves, is this something that the top position at MAGFest, the person who's at the top of MAGFest Incorporated, should be responsible for, accountable for, consulted on, or informed of? And what that really means is like, hey, is this something where they're doing the actual work? They're responsible for it in the sense that like they're the one who does it? Are they accountable for it? Meaning like they have to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down before it can go forward? Are they consulted on it, where they have to be looped in before any decision is made and have the opportunity to offer input, even if they're not the one ultimately making the call, making the decision? Or, is this something that they just need to be informed of? Are they like CC'd on the email? Are they in the meeting? Are they like part of the, are they aware of what's going on, even if their input is not actively being solicited? And so the board of directors and the MAGFest office, both started off doing it first separately and then together, kind of went line by line through this list of responsibilities. And then we added onto that list and we talked about, what should the MAGFest office look like? Just ignoring what it's been in the past. Who should be doing what? And, some of the stuff is stuff that, I don't expect a lot of people are going to care about. And, and in the particulars, there's really no reason for us to care about. When it comes to something like reimbursements, then obviously it's important that proper financial controls are in place, but the particulars of who signs off on what, whatever, that doesn't affect the culture of the organization. But there are a lot of other things that do. When we talk about who gets to decide, who decides and who's involved in the discussion and who makes the call and who's consulted on who becomes a department head, who needs to stop being a department head, who becomes a division head, who becomes an event leader, who do each of those people report to, who's in the meetings where things are decided, and then and ultimately who makes the call on when people in any of those positions need to be removed. Those are things that have a really significant impact on MAGFest Incorporated as an organization, and honestly a lot of the discussions that we've had over the last year with people at all levels of the organization, volunteers at every part. A lot of that has revolved around those things and revolved around hey, how are those decisions being made and who's doing them, and are our concerns being met, and are we getting that kind of support? And so we're going to have a lot more. So if you're interested in the particulars of that, of who's doing what and how that all works, then you should definitely keep tuning into these BOD Fireside chats, and in particular we're going to be having one on tentatively right now on Thursday, September 26th, where we talk about some of the stuff. But between then and now, then the board of directors is going to be working with the advisory task force, not only on these questions of who's doing what, but how do we actually evaluate this? How do we decide whether or not these things that we're doing are working? Because hey, look, we've acknowledged that there are problems, that that there are areas where we've got too many people reporting to one person, and we have volunteers who feel like they're not getting the support that they need, or whatever. So how do we make sure that that's all working, and that that those positions are working out, that people are getting the support they need, and that the people in those roles are thriving and really doing what MAGFest needs them to be doing. So we're going to be working to work that out, and then to actually conduct those evaluations. And in the past we've done sort of annual-ish evaluations. Again, annual performance review of the executive director is one of the things that the board of directors does. But as we make these big changes, it's very important that we check in on more than a once every year basis to see how this is working. And it's also really important that it not just be one small group of people, 3 or 4 people on the board of directors, giving a thumbs up or thumbs down to what's happened, which is why we're kind of looping in the advisory task force on a lot of this, getting their kind of opinions and perspective, and then looping in other stakeholders as well, as this goes forward. And so I want to kind of, before I go forward, and move on to questions, I just want to come back to that disclaimer that, a lot of this, the particulars of this may be informed by some of the professional opinions we've gotten, whether that's from, from Tracy, who has gotten this kind of oral history of MAGFest as part of this review, or from Bunny, our general counsel, but ultimately, this restructuring is something we started talking about back in 2018. It's something we were working on for months before this HR process began. And so, this is happening after, but not because of all of this. But we did feel like it was relevant to talk about. And again, if you want to talk about any of this, obviously I'm about to, I'll answer any of your questions, starting about now, and then we'll jump into a Google Meet and we can talk more. But if you want to have follow-up conversations, definitely email bod@magfest.org, email bodadvisory@magfest.org, contact individual BOD members or individual advisory task force members. We want to talk to you guys. We want to hear your concerns and be able to address anything, and also just tell you where we're at in that process. So let me see here. So someone says that we mentioned that we were happy to get HR assistants to do HR. So like, why didn't we do this sooner? Like, why didn't we have an HR person, kind of sooner than this, like, over the past, couple of years? Hey, that's a really good question. And, I think some of you may have seen a presentation that Nick gave at Spring MagCon. I'm probably going to butcher the exact title, but it was basically like 10 reasons why you learned that hiring an HR person is something you should have done a lot earlier. I mean, I think this is a genuine, like, kind of mistake that MAGFest has made, like, as an organization, is just like, we've tried to follow best practices, and in fact, we did have an external HR service that we used before this. But it took us quite some time to realize that we were not happy with the level of support that that third party was offering us, and that we really needed to go in a different direction. And so we started looking kind of right after the end of Super, and it took us a little while to evaluate a couple of people and then settle on someone. But yes, I think that, like, going forward, that is something that we are very happy to be doing. Someone else says, can we post the link for contacting the BOD anonymously in Slack? It was covered up on my screen. Yes, absolutely. Let me real quick get that for you. There's like a bit.ly link that's like a shortened version, but if it's just a clickable link in Slack, I'll just... All right. And then I think as Joel has said in like in Slack, we're going to be doing a Google Meet after this. So if again, like, I'm happy to, like, answer any Q&A questions that people have now. It looks like these are all of the ones that have come in so far. I'm guessing that people might prefer a more sort of conversational approach to all of these. In which case, I am happy to do that. So let me grab and then post this link in Slack, and we can all jump into that if that's how people would prefer to talk. All right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. I appreciate you guys bearing with me through some of the technical difficulties, and I will... Oh my goodness, I have just realized that I never hit the start recording button on here, so I sure hope that YouTube is supposed to save this, but I'm going to make sure that I download a copy of that before before it, like, disappears like it did on Twitch last time. Because if I hadn't done that, we wouldn't have a copy of the last one. All right, I'm going to see you guys in that Google Meet in just a minute. Thank you so much.